subject, God sets the times. That means times in our lives, the seasons of our lives. Now, if you remember last week, I said that Ecclesiastes was probably written to Jews who were out for gain. They had an opportunity to get money and get rich. And the writer reminds them to not focus only on life under the sun. In other words, this world, this fallen world, because things won't work out here and God has much better for us. I believe one big key teaching of Ecclesiastes is to remind us that we live in a fallen world. And I told you last week, if you remember, about an experiment you could try. If you try watching the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, you know, when they go up the beaches of Normandy and they're all being shot to pieces, and at the same time play a beautiful piece of music. There's a song called It's a Beautiful World by the band Coldplay. And it's very surreal to watch them singing, It's a Beautiful World, whilst all this horrible stuff is going on. But that is exactly what being in a fallen world is like, because you've got to admit, there are some beautiful things, aren't there, in this world? Really beautiful things. I went camping not long ago. There's a place in Bodmin in a microclimate valley. It's idyllic. It's brilliant. Beautiful weather. It keeps you warm when everyone else is cold. When it's drizzling and raining on the moors, it's actually nice and sunny in the campsite. It's got a microclimate. And I was loving this holiday out with nice food, enjoying it. And then I went for a walk, nice breezy summer morning. And then as I walked along, there on the road, there was a dead, squished animal. And I thought, oh, that's just ruined it. What's death doing here? But that's a picture, isn't it, of the fallen world we're in. There was an interview done with some students at a university I heard about, and they asked these students, what's wrong with the world? And one girl said, well, poverty, homelessness, war, hunger. And then she paused and said, everything really. Now, if I were to give you a cup of coffee like this, what would you think? A nice cup of coffee with a fly in it. I'll give it to Ray. Let's pick on Ray. Give Ray a nice cup of coffee with a fly in it. Now, Ray is going to say, I'm not drinking that. And I could say to him, what's the fuss? There's more coffee in there than fly. But the point is, it doesn't matter there's more coffee than a fly. The point is the cup is ruined. That's a bit like this world. In a fallen world, and God has allowed this, you know, it says in Romans, the world is subjected to futility by him who subjected it. God has allowed it because of the fall. But one thing he will use is times and seasons in your life. He will use, in a fallen world, God uses times and seasons in your life. Times and seasons cause life to be both beautiful and a burden, okay? Beautiful and a burden. So there are some beautiful things in the passage that Joey read. You know, life is beautiful. I mean, for example, it says there, in verse 11 of chapter 3, he has made everything beautiful in its time. So there are times when things in your life are beautiful. And then it says in verse 12, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful. Some translations, I think the NIV says happy or rejoice and do good as long as you live. You know, there's a call to be happy. And if you remember the list of things that were in the reading, birth, the positive things, I mean. You know, there was birth mentioned, there was laughter mentioned, there was dancing mentioned, there was embracing mentioned. There's a number of things in there that were actually really, really positive. And the last little verse on the screen there, it says there in verse 13 that all of us should eat and drink and enjoy what we have. You know, if you go through a season in your life when it's going well, enjoy it to the full. It's a gift of God. Don't be a Marvin. You remember Marvin from last week? A negative, you know, oh, I mustn't enjoy myself too much. Maybe the Lord's cross. No, enjoy it. If God's blessing you, enjoy that meal, enjoy your family, you know, the gift of God. And the people to whom the writer was writing were thinking about gain. gaining things, pursuing wealth, pursuing things. And the writer is reminding them that, well, it's gift. Enjoy it. Enjoy the good times. There are good times in all our lives. But as we know, there are also bad times. Because life is beautiful, but life is also a burden. It says in verse 10 of the passage, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. And then in chapter 1, which we're not reading today, verse 13, it says, what a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. So life is both beautiful and a burden. And God uses time to sort of, in this way. Now, why is life a burden? You've probably got plenty of answers, but why is life a burden according to this passage? Well, here's one reason. Life is an endless round of opposite things. You know, opposite things. So let's think about it. In the passage, we've got birth, death. You've got laughter, weeping. You've got building up, breaking down. You know, do you know? Opposites. It's the ups and downs of life, and it's a little bit like a pendulum on a clock. You know, it swings one way, swings the next way. And this passage talks about things that we would welcome, like a birth. A birth is great, and things that are distasteful, like a death, things that we would rather not have. But God allows these beautiful times and these times of burden. And you sort of start thinking, well, why is life like this? The passage begins by talking about personal life, so a time to be born and a time to die. And if you notice at the end of the passage, the end of the poem, because verses 2 to 8 are like a poem, it talks about the nation. It talks about a time for war and a time for peace. So it goes from the personal to the national. And it is a poem. Now, I'm not going to go into all the different opposites, but what you have to notice is sometimes one thing cancels out the other. You know, you have a birth, you have a death. You have a time of dancing, you have a time of weeping. They cancel each other out like a pendulum. You think, what is going on? Why is the world like this? Why? But in Hebrew poetry, when you have two opposites, birth and death, it doesn't just mean being born as a baby and dying. It means birth and death and everything in between. That's what it means. So a time to be born and a time to die means your whole life will be one big pendulum. It's like saying great and small and all the sizes in between. That's what this poem is doing. They cancel each other out. And so life, you've got to admit, all of you admit, life is like this. Another reason why life is a burden, because it causes you to say, well, what's the point? What's the point? You know, what's the point? It says in verse 9, what gain has the worker from his toil? And you remember last week I said you can work 100,000 hours in your life, you can buy a nice house, have a nice pension, but then you die and someone else gets your house. Your kids get it. Oh, it's like, well, what's the point? So life is a burden. People ask, what's the point? A third reason why life is a burden is things don't last. Things in life don't last. I mean, death, for example, brings things to an end. Sure, something is beautiful, it says beautiful, but it's only beautiful in its time, verse 11. Then it's gone. It's over. So you can have a nice family, and it's beautiful for many, many years, but eventually that goes. It's beautiful in its time. I mean, I've got a pet called Mittens. I love that cat. I kiss that cat more than anyone else in the household. Poor Karina. It gets kissed endlessly. We love the cat, and it's beautiful in its time, but one day the cat will go. Beautiful in its time. Okay, now I wanted to say this about where my kids go. My kids love a place called Flambards. It's a big amusement park. And I know Mark and your family, I think, have been there or down in that area. And there's a ride on Flambards, a fairground ride called the Thunderbolt. And I've been on it, and boy, your whole stomach goes up and down, because this thing doesn't just spin, but it goes upwards and downwards, and you really don't know where you are. Karina refuses to go on it. But I love it, and the kids absolutely love it. Every time they come off it, they go back to the queue, do it again, do it again. But the point about a fairground ride is there comes a point when it's over, and you've got to go home. My old dad, can we go back? When we went down to Cornwall, my kids wanted to go to Flambards every day. We said no. Life sometimes is like a fairground. It's over, you know. But having said that, we have this bizarre situation where it says in Ecclesiastes verse 11, God has also set eternity in the human heart. So something in your heart says, but I want things to last forever. I want to have eternal meaning. I want to have significance. I don't want things to stop at death. God's put that in you for a purpose. It's there by God's gift. We don't want to stop. And it makes us a bit confused, because in verse 11 it says, no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And I think that verse is trying to say, people are asking, well, what's going on with life? I don't understand it. I want to live forever, and yet things stop. Surely there must be more to life than this life under the sun. I can't fathom it out. I mean, my neighbour recently, I said this last week, my late neighbour, her husband died suddenly about a week ago. And she came around our house and doesn't usually talk to us much, but she sat for hours and talked with us. And she just said, I can't believe he doesn't exist. I think he is existing somewhere. I think he is carrying on. I can't work it out. And she was saying a bit like this, I can't fathom it out. So life is beautiful and life is a burden. The other reason life is a burden is that we can't control time, can we? The onward march of the clock. In my lounge, I have a clock that my in-laws gave me. And it's a ticking clock. Tick, 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 tick. And it just keeps on ticking. You can't stop it ticking. Right, I suppose you could, but you know what I mean? You can't stop clocks ticking. But we can't control time, can we? We would love to. I would love to stop my hair going grey. I've wanted to buy, what's it called? Sure for Men. The black colouring. And my wife has often said, don't be so stupid. But anyway, you can't stop the onward march of time. And my daughter, Daniela, she loves trampolining with me. It's very funny what she does. She sometimes stuffs a football up her jumper and jumps and pretends until the baby comes out. It's called giving birth on the trampoline. But anyway, it's a game we play, and she dumps, and she loves it. And when I do it with her, she loves it. But you know, when I'm too busy and can't do it, she says to me, Daddy, I wish I could go back in time on the trampoline with you. It was such fun. I said, sorry, you can't go back in time. We haven't invented that yet. But you see, there's a great film, I just mentioned this, The Time Traveler's Wife. I don't know if any of you have seen this film. Anyone seen the movie? Well, basically, the movie is about a girl called Claire, who's the age 6, and she meets a chap called Henry, who's, I think, about 31. So she's only 6, and he's 31, and he's a librarian. But he has this strange thing that happens to him. He suddenly, from time to time, out of his control, he travels in time. And he suddenly vanishes and appears years down the line in different places, and he can't control it. It's out of his control. And one day he suddenly gets whisked off into time, and he meets Claire, and Claire is 23, and he's 31, and they get married. He doesn't marry a 6-year-old. And I think the point of this movie is it's a metaphor to say to us, time controls so much of our lives, but we just can't control it. We wish we could, but we can't. So life is a burden. Now, the God who sets the times and the seasons has allowed life to be beautiful and a burden. Why? Why? Why are we not in control? Well, I think one of the big reasons, it says in this passage, this is the big teaching, if you like, of this particular passage today. God does it so that people will fear him or stand in awe of him. Okay? Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. There are people that do not stand in awe of God. For example, an atheist. An atheist will, like Richard Dawkins or some top professor, they might mock God. Christopher Hitchens was one. Some scientists are not Christians and they will not stand in awe of God and just say, don't be ridiculous. But then you get theologians, people that study in Bible colleges, and they don't stand in awe of God sometimes because they pick it all apart, pick the Bible apart, take it all apart, but don't really stand in awe of God. And then even Christians, present company excluded, but even Christians cannot stand in awe of God. They can treat God as their pal and get very angry with him when he doesn't do what they want. And treat God like a doggy on a lead and say, you're at my beck and call. You haven't done what I want. I'm angry. I'm cross with you. I'm furious. Now, of course, you are allowed to lament. You are allowed to pray to God and say, Lord, this is horrible. You're allowed to be honest. But you're not really to treat God as your little pet. You see, we're to treat God as God truly is, to stand in awe of him. And I think that's the purpose of life, being like this, is so that we learn to be humble and stand in awe of God in all that we pass through and seek him humbly. Now, how? How do we stand in awe of God? Let's get practical. What does it mean? I think it's very simple. In many ways, it's this. Walk humbly with God in every season you pass through. Okay? Jesus cooperated with the seasons his Father set him, and we should too. Jesus taught us to stand in awe of God. He said, you're to fear God, fear the one who can put people into hell. Fear him. Don't fear those people that can kill you, but fear God. He said, stand in awe of God. And he said, when you pray, pray to your Father in heaven. God is in heaven. Stand in awe of him. And then Jesus understood that there are times and seasons in your life that God the Father sets. So, for example, Jesus would often say, my hour is not yet come. Or my time is drawn near. He kind of had a recognition that God was arranging the time appointed for him to die. And I think we need to learn this. I mean, it's very hard, but we need to learn to not just, to cooperate really with the season. Now, there's a picture of the tide coming in and out. The ebb and flow of the tide. Well, in your life, you'll get really great times and really bad times. And what the secret of this passage is, we're to stand in awe of God. And when things go wrong, when the tide goes out, or in, when it's bad, rather than getting angry and kicking a fuss and swearing at God, and you just say, well, Lord, why am I going through this? Ask God a question. Well, why am I going through this, Lord? Are you trying to teach me something? Now, you might not get an answer. You might get a silence, but there might be a purpose. You might say, well, Lord, is there a purpose? Is there a reason why I'm going through this season? Are you trying to, rather than just rejecting God's love and saying, God doesn't love me. I just want to say that I once went through a very difficult time, me and Karina, for 3 years. Not because of each other. Me and Karina went through a very difficult season. It went on for 3 years, and we wanted to run away. We wanted to just run as far as we could. And we both felt God saying, stay in the boat. Stay in the boat. Don't leave the boat. Don't run. But just live with it. And it was a difficult season. But we stuck it out, and then the Lord eventually blessed us. We had to learn to walk very humbly with God in a very difficult season. I know of a man who's recently gone to be with Jesus called Norman Meaton. A couple of people here know him. He was a great preacher, went all around the world, preached in India I think he visited India 55 times to share the gospel. He loved people in India. And he was in pretty much constant pain for much of his life. He had lots of bone problems with his neck. And he was in a lot of pain, and he prayed and prayed to be healed. And it seemed, there was one time when he seemed to get better, but generally, God did not heal him. And people would say to him, why are you going through this? Why is God doing this to you? You're a great preacher. Why? And he said, I don't know, but I know that God is permitting, the Father who sets the times and seasons has permitted this, and I've got to walk humbly with him in it. And people said to Norman Meaton, they said to him, how are you so sweet? Why are you such a sweet person when you're in pain? What have you got that I haven't got? If I was in that much pain, I would be a grumpy old so-and-so. But you're so sweet. What have you got? And it actually spoke to people, the fact that he was in pain and he was still sweet. So you don't know what God does with these things. So if you're going through a time of weeping or mourning, fear God, trust him. Stand in awe of him. Say, what is this about, Lord? Don't waste it. Seize that time. Seize even the times of mourning and loss. Don't just reject them and get angry, but grab these times and say, well, the Lord, why am I going through this? It's an act of faith. It really is an act of faith to say, God is setting my seasons. Doesn't mean God wants you to be in pain, but maybe he's allowing things, for it. I think of Job. Job, remember him? He said, even though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Job was pretty good faith. So cooperate with the season. Here's a quick little analogy I thought of. If it's winter time, you can't control the winter. You might rebel against it, though. You might say, I defy winter. I'm going to go outside in my shorts. Bare top. If you're a man. I'm going to go outside bare top and run around in my shorts, even though it's winter. Well, yeah, you can. But you're not cooperating with the season you're in. We got one or two gardeners here, or ex-gardeners. Now, I'm sure they will tell you, you can say, I'm going to plant daffodils whenever I want. Yeah, you can. You can plant daffodil whenever you want. But if you go and plant it in the middle of frosty winter, it's probably not going to work. Because you can control when you plant it, but you can't command the seasons. So it's probably a lot wiser to try and plant the daffodil bulbs in autumn. Is that right? Spring? September, yeah. Okay. Cooperate with the season. If you're going through a time of sorrow, you just laugh it off. I mean, some Christians, when they go through sorrow, they just say, oh, praise Jesus, everything's great. It's not great. Admit it. Be humble. Or if you're going through a time of dancing, don't be grumpy and miserable. If it's a time for you to repent and turn to Christ, don't harden yourself and say, well, I'm not repenting. I heard someone once say, I'll just read this out. Wise is the man who moves with the tide that God sets. Okay? So what season are we going through? What season am I going through? Are you going through a season of sorrow? Are you going through a season of persecution? Are you going through a season of waiting? You're waiting for an answer. What season are you in? And are you walking humbly with God in it? I thought of a few other seasons. A season to be baptized. Maybe some of you need to be dunked in that pond over there. Or a season to become a Christian. Or a season to seek the Lord. Maybe it's just time for you to seek the Lord. That's the season. Or a time just to endure. So I want to comment on something called the tapestry of time, which you may have heard me say before. But I want to ask you this question. Do you believe that God is weaving a pattern that will last eternally, forever, even using the hard seasons you pass through? I think when you suffer, if you're a Christian, it's not wasted. I think God can use it to weave something permanent if for his glory. So in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 14, we read these words. It says, I know that everything God does endures forever. And I think that can mean that when you suffer tribulation and hardship, you don't know, maybe what you're going through is working in you something eternally glorious. But one day, on the other side of glory, you'll see that God used that. You know what they say about the oyster? Oyster? Yeah, the oyster. How does it make a jewel? How does it make a pearl? How does it make a beautiful pearl? It has something irritates it. A bit of grit gets stuck in the oyster and it irritates the oyster, so the oyster creates a pearl. That's how pearls are made, through something getting irritated. You ever get irritated? God does endures forever. And I think he's weaving something beautiful that you one day will see when you get to heaven. Now, the scriptures also say, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. In Romans 8, verse 28, it says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. But sometimes your life will feel a right mess, like that tapestry. Sometimes your life, you look at it and you think it's a mess. There's seasons of pain and difficulty. And you might see black threads running through it, sorrow. You might see gold threads, times of joy. You might see, I don't know what the colours mean, grey ones, boring, times that are boring. Red, suffering. And you might think, what is God doing? But I want to say, I believe he's weaving. And when you get to heaven, if you walk humbly with your Lord, he'll turn it round and you'll see he's made a beautiful picture. That tapestry, by the way, is from Holland. And if you know that, it's from Haarlem, Corrie ten Boom's house. Corrie ten Boom used this once as an illustration. She said, sometimes your prayers don't get answered. Sometimes you suffer and you think everything looks like that. But if you trust the Lord and walk with him, God's making a pattern. And as Debbie said, we'll finish with these words. My times are in your hands. My times are in your hands. So God uses times and seasons, brothers and sisters, in a fallen world for his purpose. One, so you will stand in awe of him. Okay? And two, we need to learn to cooperate with the season